All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. This day actually marks the end to our Stronger Together series, a roadmap to an effective homeless system. Today's topic is going to be centered around what an effective, equitable homeless response system is, and really is a culmination of all the sessions that we've had in 2024. Hoping that we do have some new folks today. If we do, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. There's a little bit of information about the Alliance right up on your screen. We do three primary functions: policy and programs, research and evidence, and of course, capacity building. Specific to the Center for Capacity Building, we're the team that works with communities to really implement those effective policy solutions that are grounded in research and evidence. And you just got a chance to learn a little bit about our team and the work through our video. So if you are new or old here today, just some statements for participation up there on your screen. We really value diversity, and we invite everyone to join our webinars, but we do have a very strong commitment to preventing any discrimination or abusive behavior in our webinar series. We really want to create a safe and respectful environment for all of our participants. So if you ever experience discomfort or witness any issues during this webinar, please just shout out the hosts and panelists via the chat or even in the Q&A. We want to make sure that this is a diverse and inclusive and welcoming space for everyone. Few housekeeping rules. We are recording today. If you would like to ask questions, we do have a Q&A function that you can submit those questions through. This webinar, again, is recorded. We tend to get that question a lot. It will be recorded. It will be posted with accompanying documents. Closed captions are also enabled, but you may have to turn them on in your setting to actually see them. Those closed captions will be included on the recording as well. So if you're able to, I see we've already got some momentum going in the chat. If you're able to, you can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And otherwise, I'm going to move us right along. One of the premises behind the Alliance launching the Roundtable Series earlier in January of this year was to really help people understand the core elements of an effective system, understand the importance of each evidence-based intervention as it relates to the overall system, while recognizing the importance of centering not just equity and justice, but most importantly, the voices of people with lived experience in our response to homelessness. So we've had an opportunity to really cover how to ensure fidelity to each evidence-based model throughout the previous series, and also understanding some of the creative and innovative approaches for getting our folks out of homelessness and back into permanent housing. So you can check out the whole series on our website. We've got not just the recordings there, but also accompanying documents and really important resources to help you strengthen your programs on the ground. So why did we come up with this? The notion of the project really was to address unsheltered homelessness. But as we were putting this together, we thought about it from a more holistic lens. And you can't end unsheltered homelessness without looking at the system from a total view. So what do we mean when we say effective, efficient, and equitable homeless response system? At the Alliance, we believe the goal of what we call internally the 3E homeless response system is having all of the components aligned so that interventions have a shared goal, a shared vision of helping people to not enter homelessness whenever possible, so diverting people who are at imminent risk of homelessness, but also to rehouse them as quickly as possible if they do enter our system and experience homelessness. Communities we've found in our work throughout the country, those communities with the best results have a really deep and intentional focus on housing people as quickly as possible.
Hey, MFK, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we've got something blocking the screen share. There's a rectangle in the middle of the screen?
Sorry, that was the chat box. Thank you so much, Rachel. Apologies for that, folks. So when we talk about the end game from an Alliance perspective is that homelessness is rare, brief, and one time. So again, and you'll hear us say this very commonly in any of our webinars, but particularly today, making sure that people that are in crisis have access to that immediate help, which includes a safe place to go, preventing unsheltered homelessness whenever possible, making sure that people aren't spending prolonged periods of time experiencing homelessness. And also, if they do fall into homelessness, let's get them back to housing as quickly as possible. So, of course, I'm hoping that many of you are familiar with something called our system performance measures. This is something that HUD takes a look at. We have a position that within your system, you should not just follow the system performance measures, but actually look at how you're doing on reducing inflow into homelessness, increasing exits to permanent housing, while decreasing both the average length of time that people are experiencing homelessness, while making sure that once they have gotten rehoused, they don't come back into your system. So how, one of the questions that we encourage communities to ask is how your system is aligning with that end game. When it comes to how you do this, there's a wide variety of ways that you can do this. Of course, often the first point of engagement is going to be street outreach for folks that are unsheltered. But there's also, targeted homelessness prevention, diversion. We've got our coordinated entry system that's a huge driver of the overall homeless response system. We've got our emergency shelter and then a range of different approaches to rehousing people, which include both permanent through rapid rehousing or supportive housing, and also more interim solutions through transitional housing. All of that, regardless of the intervention, we believe in the research and evidence, which is a housing first approach and philosophy. We believe that using data to inform decision making for all of the different systems components is really critical, centering equity and making sure that we're coordinating towards that common goal of preventing homelessness wherever possible and quickly resolving it for folks when they do fall into homelessness. So to really understand how a system is performing, it's important to talk about system flow, and that people are coming in and out of the system all the time. It's not a closed system. System flow is really a description of the way a homeless response system should move people into housing as quickly as possible. So you see a little infographic on your screen. If you think about one of those cars, think of a car as a program. If one of them stops, the flow is going to stop and it's going to back traffic up. Well, our homeless response system is very much the same way. And we want to make sure that we are addressing the system with the decisions that we make and assessing how the throughput or the system flow works in our system. So if you consider how resources are also being utilized and working together, right, on the right-hand side, if you're making investments and you're not taking into consideration how each program or program component within your system is coordinated, you end up with a little bit of a traffic jam, or more than a traffic jam, because the pieces have to work together. But if the interventions work together, then the pattern is a lot more seamless. There's a lot of traffic control, so to speak. All right, so I'm going to move us right along. I'm super excited today because we're going to have a panel discussion. So I'm actually going to stop sharing so that I can share a little bit about our speakers today. Super excited. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Mary Frances Kenyon. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Black woman who is based in Southern Maryland, but I'm actually at the Alliance offices in Washington, D.C., which is my hometown. Super excited to be here with the folks who are your panelists today. I'm going to give a brief intro and then kind of tell you how I know them. This is going to be the least formal roundtable series that we've had and the most casual because I feel like I'm in a space with friends right now. So first up, we've got Mike Savara. I've had the opportunity to work overtime with Mike. He is repping the state of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, and he's actually bringing the state level lens to this systems conversation. Next up is Kiana Fisher. I have moved around a little bit, but keep finding myself attached to Kiana and the great folks at Austin Echo. Kiana has done some absolutely amazing work as a system leader in Austin, Texas. And we're just so excited to continue our partnership with Austin Echo. And then we have Chris Freed. Chris Freed is someone who actually transitioned from direct service, like me. I'm a recovering direct service provider and systems leader, into consulting and technical assistance. So Chris is really bringing the lens of a recovering direct service provider and someone who is now working with communities outside of Los Angeles. So a lot of rich experience, a lot of diverse perspectives, also naming that Mike, specifically with the state level lens, if you're not familiar with the state of Oregon, there's a hugely vast amount of rural communities in Oregon. So he will get to touch on some of the rural implications because I feel like our rural folks often get left out of the conversation. So I did kind of steal your intro, but I would love for each of you to kind of introduce yourself from the lens of like how long you've been in the homelessness field. And when did you start recognizing that the issue of homelessness was actually systemic?
I'm happy to jump in first, if it's all right. Thank you so much, Mary Frances, for the introduction. So again, my name is Mike Savara. I use he, him, his pronouns. I identify as a white man, and I am coming today from Hillsboro, Oregon, just a suburb of Portland, Oregon. Super excited to be here for the conversation. I think, I've been in this field now since 2011. And so I came at it, really from the perspective of a direct service provider. So I worked for about a decade as behavioral health provider, as a shelter operator, as a street outreach worker, and really started to see how my efforts as a person trying to support people exiting homelessness, as a person trying to support people living with mental illness or addiction, was often hampered by our systems. Like, it didn't matter how much I tried sometimes to show that I cared for the clients I was working with, that I was engaged in relationship building, that I was working to understand that perspective. It just felt like I was pushing a boulder up a hill oftentimes. And I think that's when I started to get curious about why it was so difficult for the folks that I was working with that were getting behavioral health services to access the homelessness system. They were struggling with houselessness, and I was providing behavioral health services, but not having those connections, not having that integration was a system issue at the end of the day. I think I also saw this time and time again when seeing how some of my clients who identified as folks from marginalized communities, LGBTQ folks, communities of color, like they often had a different experience than some of the folks that I worked with who maybe were white and had an experience of privilege moving through that system and getting believed more earnestly, more readily from folks that were gatekeeping or running that system. And I think those systemic challenges around disparities pointed me into the direction of realizing that, like, oh, like we've created this problem through system making, through building these things and institutionalizing racism into the ways that we think and practice in our systems, and that direct service is a really critical element of this. And we have to think about how direct service providers can't do it all. They are not able to solve all the problems alone. And so I think that's a bit of how I landed into the state level. It's really important to me that we think about how we learn from people with lived experience and people that are doing the work on the ground to influence our system design.
Go, Kiana.
Okay, hey y'all. My name is Kiana Fisher. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as Black African American. I am a mom, a sister, a daughter, and I have the pleasure of working in the homeless response system in the city that I grew up in. And so I work at Austin Echo. We are the COC lead agency. And I have been working in homeless services, housing and homelessness for about 15 years. First as a direct service provider, and then right around COVID, right around 2020, shifting into the systems work. It's really interesting how that happened for me. It was not an easy shift because I learned so much about this work from the people that I had the pleasure of serving. And so making the choice to shift to systems work felt away. It felt away. But it also was really important for me that I stay connected in a real humanistic way to the faces and experiences of those that were creating work and system and flow and programming for. Before I pass it to Chris, I just wanted to say that I think it's really important and maybe unique that I get to serve the community that I grew up in. So when we're developing programming and process improvements, we're really doing so for folks that are in my family, for folks that I went to school with, for those that I see at the corner store. We share at HEB, and I just think it's really important that those of us that are sitting in positional power around these systems recognize and are accountable to those that we serve.
So thank you for that, Kiana. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Freed, and as Mary Frances said, I'm a recovering provider. So I've been in the work for over a quarter of a century. I know I look young, but I am OLD. And I'm also a person with lived experience. So I think the work for me overall is really important. And I think from someone who was within the systems of care that we have, from many different systems that we have as a society, really understanding the impact that they create in people's lives. One thing that you said, Kiana, that really resonated with me is as a provider, I was a provider in my community as well, and more specifically in the community in which I ran the streets when I was experiencing homelessness. And so my family, oftentimes when we go to the store or when we go to places in the community, she'll always say, "You were like the most popular person in life. Like, how do so many people know you?" I'm like, "Oh, you really do not want that story." You do not want that story. So I think it's really important there. But in terms of really getting kind of connected to the system, for me, it was really within my first leadership role at my organization, where I started to see the themes repeat over and over and over again, and started to really understand that that this was bigger than just one thing or one system, right? And so the themes became way more pronounced for me, and perhaps because I was responsible for programs in a new way, the things became louder, that I needed to do something differently, that my approach needed to be a little bit different. And so I started to see the collection, and at that same point, I was starting to see the collection of all the different system failures. And again, I've been part of many of the different systems and understood, right? Coming out of a prison system and the expectation to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's really hard for anybody coming out of the system, but it's even more difficult for people of color coming out of the system, right? I was able to go and get a job, but a lot of people with the same background as me were not able to go get a job. Someone like me has been able to climb within the system, both at an executive level within Los Angeles, but now even more on a national presence. That's not going to be true for everyone. And so really seeing the disparities within the systems, I think, was really important for me. So I started really working from the position when I was at my organization that I wasn't just going to fix my programs or my agency, but I was really going to work from a different lens. I was going to try to use my agency and my programs as a trial board for the things that needed to improve within the system, but always really thinking about, especially as a provider in LA, thinking about how do we make the system better for LA, and using my opportunity within my organization to be able to try things and do things a little bit differently. So for me, the system is the most important component. We have to fix the system. Fixing one program at a time is great, but it's not going to make the impact that we need it to make. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I'll stop there.
Awesome. So I'm ready to dive in at this point. So question for panelists. You all know, we know this. I'm not sure if this is a common thread nationwide. I suspect it is. Some of our interventions that are rooted in research and evidence that have worked in the past, we know that they've fallen short in the sense that some groups have been left behind, right? If we're just having an honest conversation, whether that's across racial, ethnic, gender, LGBTQ, geographic lines in particular. What have you learned about disparities, racial disparities in homelessness, and how have you started to use that knowledge as you approach systems level work? What does that look like? What are some concrete examples? And Mike, I'm actually going to pick on you first.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the question. Man, a couple thoughts first. I mean, I think about my role, especially as a white person in a government institution. I work for a housing finance agency. I think about our deep roots in as housing agencies, as state government, as government in general, in promoting and producing policies and enacting policies that have really harmed communities of color and other groups for many years. So I think I often have to remind myself that that's where we're starting in a lot of ways. Like that legacy is still very much alive in so many ways. I think a couple things that we've really tried to wrestle with here in Oregon when thinking about our role around creating systems that have driven a lot of these inequities is about how we think about the access to resources. I think that's a major one. So we have historically funded certain organizations that don't always represent every single community across Oregon, and that doesn't represent the diversity of Oregon's residents, especially those experiencing disparate impacts from homelessness. And that decision, the policy decision to only fund certain organizations and say, no, we will not fund other organizations, is in itself driving a lot of the inequities. It means that folks that are doing this work that are maybe part of culturally specific organizations or helping support groups that are really experiencing the brunt of this impact from racial disparities are not actually able to get the resources. And so those types of decisions where we're saying this organization or network of organizations gets the resource and this one doesn't is a major choice that drives these disparities. So I think reevaluating why we do what we do when we push funds out is one major piece. I think a second one is when we create opportunities for funding, every organization that receives state dollars, that receives public resources, ought to be accountable to ensuring that they're creating programs that are driving down disparities, that they're doing the analysis, the hard work of understanding the problem. They're looking at their point in time count resources. They're looking at engaging and having direct qualitative conversations with communities that are impacted, and forming a plan for how to resolve those things to the extent that they can with those resources. So we've started to think like when we deploy money down to a local community, the main thing that we're asking for is this framework around targeted universalism, which is a really big concept that we probably can't get into a ton today, but really I like to think of it as it breaks down the idea that every intervention we deploy throughout our system doesn't work the same way for every community, and we need to have targeted strategies that work maybe differently or for different populations that can help us understand what those universal needs will be. So I think Housing First is actually like a really good example of a targeted universalism framework that has been used and has been found to work incredibly well for a variety of other populations besides just who it started with, focusing on people with severe mental illness. And we can do that same work by challenging communities that are, need to be accountable for those results and driving the data that they're producing. Exactly how many people did you serve that were of these demographics? What were the learnings? And engaging communities about how they can do better around those goals. So that's a little bit of the things that we've wrestled with. This is such an important part of the conversation. I think the funding structure pieces, as well as that accountability for every organization to drive towards these results, is a big part of this conversation for me.
And Mike, just a quick follow-up question for you. Oregon did a thing, kind of emerging from the pandemic. Can you talk just briefly about the 9 tribes in the state of Oregon as it relates to the funding structure piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, really kind of out of the pandemic, thinking about our system, we've really started to have some different conversations than I think we had before. We saw that the influx of federal resources, as well as the reality that we had to think differently about how we were creating the challenges that we were creating across our state. We started to look at the results of those policy decisions that we had been making for many years. And a lot of the results that we found in the data were that there were some very serious disparities. And one of those populations that we found was that Native American Alaska Islanders were vastly overrepresented in our population of people experiencing homelessness in Oregon compared to their population in the general population. So we saw the data, the problem, and we also said, well, how do we start to solve this? What are the ways that we could do this? And we started to a very intentional conversation with the sovereign tribes. There are 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. We started these very intentional conversations with them and said, what is it that would work for you and your communities as sovereign nations? And they helped us understand where the challenges were for them, where the rub was, and started to say we need to provide ongoing resources that are flexible to these sovereign nations to be able to support community members, their community members, in their own unique ways. Again, thinking about that targeted universalism framework I was mentioning before, like we saw the data and we started to say, how do we have conversations with the experts and with the folks that are closest to these community members and provide them the maximum amount of flexibility that our resources could allow. And we're so honored that these tribal nations are willing to work with us in light of the context of government continuing to be unable or unwilling, often the U.S. government being unwilling to engage with our partners. And I think that it's such an important process for us. At this point, we're really trying to think about how do we build on the work that we've done so far to provide some resources for these tribes to be able to build those systems and expand the opportunity. And we're excited about being able to build a state block grant for tribal nations in Oregon to be able to start to utilize some of the things that we've learned in broader ways, to think about home ownership and affordable rental housing, as well as homelessness services, so that tribes can really have access to a lot of the services that they're looking for.
Thanks, Mike. Kiana, can you give me your perspective on what you've learned about racial disparities and other disparities in homelessness and how you've used that knowledge to help move your system forward?
So because Mike spoke on the finance part, which I think is imperative, for each community, each COC, each homelessness response system, to look at your funding patterns, both who continues to get that legacy COC dollars, what agencies, organizations, marginalized groups are excluded from that. And then how we as a system start to braid multiple funding streams together to ensure that we are maximizing programming. So thank you, Mike, for that. I want to talk a little bit about the programming itself. So housing solves homelessness. And from my perspective, programming and service delivery is what helps folks reintegrate into communities that they choose. And regardless of the intervention type that we're utilizing to help someone in their homelessness, I think it's imperative that we are listening to the folks that have the lived experience of homelessness. And what that means is being a critical lover of our programs. I think that we can't separate the fact that our homelessness response systems were created with white supremacy culture embedded in that. And so as we're looking at our coordinated entry systems, our funding systems, and practices, we also have to look at the white supremacy culture, the racism that's built into the programming themselves, and deconstruct that, and own the impact and the harm that those things create. And so I just think it's really important for us to be able to reimagine how we do what we do, especially in the face of disparate impact, especially when we can see that folks that identify as Black are not getting access to those long-term supports. When we can see that Black folks are returning to homelessness from our systems, when we can see that we are not enrolling Black folks in programming at the rate that they're getting referred. So I just think it's really important that we have a critical love for the programs that we that end folks' homelessness. And I also think that from the COC perspective, it's very important that we be able to train direct service staff and provide that training in a meaningful way, in a hands-on way, in a way that engages the nuances and the complexities of providing services in a really political time, in a really where all eyes are on the homelessness response system. And the fact that folks really have there's a need and people that are entrusting us with providing the services deserve us to take a pause and see what's working and what's not working around our programming. And lastly, so training is really important to being able to provide meaningful training to direct service providers, and accountability. So if that's performance monitoring, if that's scorecards, we need to be ready and accountable enough to the utilizers of our system, and courageous enough to, if programs aren't successful, if strategies aren't successful, then we need to reimagine and or course correct and pivot. And I think that and that does take courage. And that does require us to slow down and do these processes in a trauma-informed way. But again, if we keep doing what we're doing, we will continue to get what we get.
Thank you, Kiana. I'm gonna pitch it over to Chris.
Yeah, I don't really, I just have a couple of things to just, first of all, Kiana, exactly what you said in terms of accountability is really key. If things aren't working, don't keep hitting your head up against the wall, take a step back. We tend to, oftentimes we just keep moving the cycle, right? The wheel just keeps turning and we never stop for a second. And in most industries, there's a pause for a minute where people have the ability to reassess what's working, what's not working, step back, right? There's new money coming in and they plan about how they want to use those dollars. Whereas we get so caught up in this cycle, we just keep throwing things at the same thing without ever filling our gaps and taking the time to step back and fill those. The other thing I would say really around, and I think that you hit it really head on, the thing that I wanted to add was we often talk about the people that we serve, but we forget about the agencies that are delivering the service. And the fact that we have shut out a lot of the smaller agencies. Right now, we're seeing huge growth of the people that are experiencing homelessness on the street. Most of, right, we already know the disparities that exist, and that so many are people of color. And yet we have these small agencies that are raising their hands saying, we want in, we want to be able to support, we want to be able to help. And yet we just keep funding the same folks over and over and over again without, right, we're seeing this explosion, but without being inclusive of who we're bringing to the table to deliver these services, without, right, the same level of training that we need to be able to provide our staff is the same level of training that we need to be able to provide to these smaller agencies that are raising their hand, because they're so often led by people of color as well, or people with lived experience as well. And one other thing that I often say just around being a person with lived experience, and something that I'm pretty proud of, is that I've never been invited, because I was very quiet about my lived experience. Unless you started with me 27 years ago, most people, right, didn't know that I necessarily had lived experience. I didn't talk about it. If you saw me 27 years ago, I wouldn't have to share that. You would know when I started in this work. But as we've gone on, right, it's kind of dropped. But I'm included in conversations because I happen to be an expert and or is seen as an expert. But I had somebody spend a lot of time with me years ago, coaching and mentoring me and bringing me kind of up in this space. So I want to be someone that's included at the table, not because I happen to be a person with lived experience, but because I happen to be an expert, just so happens to be a person with lived experience. And I think we need to think along those same lines relative to how we're bringing new agencies into this work, how we're supporting them, how we're coaching them, how we're mentoring them, how we're giving them the platform to be able to excel. Because so often they're the people that often, right, they're the leaders that are often representing the organizations that people can connect to the most. And I think we just need to figure out a way to bring them on so we can expand this work, we can expand the thought process, we can expand our partnerships, and we're not forgetting the people that can deliver these services in a meaningful way to our communities.
Awesome. So Mike, I see some comments in the chat about Oregon, and I'd really love to pitch it back to you. Because the comment is we need to declare an emergency. And in fact, there was a state of emergency declared in Oregon, Executive Order 2302. You want to talk a little bit about that work and what some of the results were?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it kind of builds off of what Chris and Kiana were saying about how we rethink some of the system, and we use emergency a lot in this field. So I think a couple of things that I'll just kind of frame up. So our governor Tina Kotek declared a state of emergency connected to unsheltered homelessness in much of the state here in Oregon on her second full day in office, or first full day in office, January 10th of 2023. And this really was a big call to say we have to do things differently. This is not a time for status quo. It is not a time for sort of continuing the same patterns. I think a big piece of what her strategy was for this as well was that we needed to have an outcomes-oriented approach to how we were solving this. So I think too often in this field, we don't really understand the impact on tracking the results that we're doing and then regularly communicating the progress. I think that was a really big element for us. So we had really big, lofty goals that the governor set for us. As a state agency, we were responsible for really implementing the resources side of it. The Oregon State Legislature really came in and matched the call and provided resources to be able to actually respond. I think one of the really exciting things about this work was that we were able to set it up in a way that aligned with what actually works, what we know how to solve homelessness. So we had an emphasis on low barrier shelters that we needed to create more of. Oregon tends to have a very high rate of unsheltered homelessness. We're one of the highest states in the country. So we knew we needed more shelter space, but we needed to make sure we were emphasizing the importance of low barrier shelters that allowed for folks' partners and pets to be able to come in with them, and so that we actually could utilize those best practices that we know about shelters. Another element that was really important as we designed this was we have to focus on how to actually end homelessness. We can't just focus on moving folks from one place to another and getting into more and more sheltering our way out of homelessness. So there was a big goal that the governor set of rehousing 1,200 households in 1 year's time under the executive order. So we had a goal of creating 600 shelter units, shelter beds to be able to create more shelter opportunities, 1,200 households that would be rehoused in a year's time. And then also we wanted to make sure that we were working to stem the flow of people into the system. And so we provided a goal of 8,750 households being prevented from becoming homeless. And so we sort of had our objectives, very big objectives, and we started to think about how to actually implement this. We knew that in every community, their strategies would look slightly different. And so we didn't want to go in and assume that every community would have to run the same program. And so we really drilled down by saying, these are the goals we're looking to achieve. These are the goals that your community will be responsible for out of the proportion of how much money you're getting and sort of your share of how many folks experience homelessness in your region. And we really let communities figure it out from there, honestly. We just got out of the way and helped focus on the overall objective rather than micromanaging the specific ways that they had to do all the things. I think this really helps us move fast because instead of like a brand new manual for folks having to run out and train everybody, they could just adopt things they were already doing. They could align it with their other rapid rehousing programs or their other interventions and not have to create a whole new thing in that same period of time. We also really challenged them to think about how race equity played into those plans. So it wasn't just, okay, here, go reach these objectives, but how are you going to improve the situation of the disparities? And we actually provided them the data with the help of the consulting firm that was helping us launch this, that Mary Frances was helping to lead. And I think that was a big part of how we set the tone as a state agency for the goals that we were looking to accomplish, but also we helped communities figure out how they were going to do that. So we also invested a lot in technical assistance so that on the ground support was there, because communities, some of them were ready to go, and others were kind of like, whoa, this is a very short period of time. This is a lot of new stuff. Like, can I talk with someone that knows what they're doing? And that was we had such a variety of responses, and we were able to really adapt to where it was at. I think that was also really helpful for us to think about how rural communities, which often the biggest challenge there wasn't the know-how, it was the capacity. They just didn't have the people because of chronic underinvestment. And so we wanted to make sure that we thought about how do we invest in flexible resources for them to hire the people to go and do the thing. And then also providing that TA as needed. So I think those are a big part of our strategies. But I mean, long story short, we were able to reach all three goals in our year's time. It was very, very difficult. The providers worked very, very long hours in those last few weeks, especially of the year. But as of January 10th, 2024, we met all three of our goals, and we're able to move forward into a second year of our executive order with additional goals, and really looking forward to the future of really creating that emergency response and moving it into a systematized way of moving forward. So it's a little bit about our story, and we've learned a lot from it for sure, and made a lot of mistakes along the way as well.
That's a follow-up question for you, Mike, and then I'm going to pivot to Kiana and Chris. What happened with the disparities using that framework? Did you all see any promising results?
Yeah, great question. We saw that when communities in their plans indicated that they were going to focus on a specific population. So for instance, one community may have said, we're noticing that the African American population in our community is very overrepresented compared to their share in the general population. When a community in their plan said that's our focus, we're gonna try and support communities by engaging with experts, by talking with community, by working with culturally specific organizations, and really thinking about how the system that we're designing and the interventions we were designing are going to work, that we found that they actually were able to support more households on average of that population. It's interesting because some of those communities had to make a decision about which population they would focus on. You know, you can't prioritize everyone. And we saw that when they didn't prioritize, you know, another population that may have been overrepresented, the results weren't there for those populations. But I think that proof of if they're focusing, if those communities have the resources behind them, and then we are challenging them in plans to actually focus on those, that we did see parity in a lot of communities that had that focus of wanting to serve a specific population, because they knew from the ground up that was their goal, that was their objective. And so we're still engaging with communities to figure out, what did you learn, what worked well, how do we move forward and really do this again and do it better in the future.
Thanks, Mike. And you've actually got a couple of questions in the Q&A if you want to take time to answer those while I pivot to, I'm actually going to go to you, Chris. So you've worked with the largest COC in the country, with the largest share of people experiencing homelessness on any given night, Los Angeles. And now you really get an opportunity to take what you've learned over your, couple of decades of experience there, both lived and professional. You get to help other communities navigate today's challenges. But you are getting to help them focus on one aspect of the system that will impact the broader whole of that system. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's that like? How are you helping communities navigate today's challenges post-pandemic? Rent is too damn high, wages are not catching up. We're just in a really tense time. Talk to me.
Yeah, I don't know that I have the perfect answer here, but I will tell you that going from a full-time provider community to, or a full-time provider rather, to a consultant has been a learning curve for sure. I've done a lot of consultant work over the years, but doing it full-time and actually working with communities in a different way is wild. So a couple of different things. Government, and I'm sure I've seen all the people introducing themselves. Oftentimes it's so refreshing when you get people like Mike on a call or even Kiana on a call, but particularly government on a call, where you actually hear that they're doing things a little bit different, a little bit more creative, a little bit more innovative, because government so often gets in the right. This is no jab. It's just truth. Bureaucracy is difficult to navigate, and it takes a lot of time. So, and now that I'm working in the midst of many different communities, governments, it's learning how to navigate and to work on the things that are the most important to those communities. I'm going to give one example of one of the things that I've been able to do, because even though I'm from LA and I do a lot of consulting around the country, I'm lucky enough to still have LA is a community that I work within. And sometimes I feel like I become a very one-note person when I start talking about some of the practices that we've put into play. And so I apologize for that for anyone who's ever heard me speak. But things like, if you want to make an immediate impact about things that are happening outside, the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. You have to do things a little bit differently. And so things like government back mass releasing, which freak people out. And I get it that Los Angeles is a really big community, but it also shows that if you have government in Los Angeles who's willing to be the ones that are putting their names and signing their names on the leases, then because they want to clean up encampments, because they want to see movement in the system, because they want throughput at every level of the system, not just one point of the system, then you're seeing a shift in a way that's positive. So I won't go down this long road of what government-backed master leasing is and all of those things. But I do think when you're willing and you have communities that are willing to be a little bit creative, a little bit innovative, where you have the willingness to move some of the bureaucracy over because you want to make an impact, you're going to see some positive change. What I will say though, are some things that I have learned. One, listen. You have to listen to people. I have a tendency to be very fast. I've said this before. I'll say it again. I've learned a new way of saying this because this made a lot of sense. I used to say I like to fly a plane while I'm learning, right, while I'm building the plane. But that is, but somebody just informed me that that's a surefire way of death, because as you're building the plane, if it doesn't have all the things, you're going to crash. So they're like, try using a boat, because oftentimes you can swim. And so if the boat sinks, you can swim. But the one thing I certainly have learned is you've got to listen when you're walking into another community. You can't move faster than what they're willing to, and you've got to focus on the things that are the most urgent and of most importance to them, and help them understand how they can get to the level that they want to. But you can't do that if you're not listening and you come in and you just start bullying your way through, because you're not going to get the buy-in in the community to actually move the pieces through. Second, you have to understand scale. When you come from a community like Los Angeles, when you come from a state like California, there's a lot of investment, a lot of money that's kind of flowing through our systems of care. I have been in other communities where I have heard the community say itself that outside of the little bit of money that they get from the federal government, that homelessness is a faith problem, and faith need to figure out how they're going to fix it. And so where there isn't any local investment, you've got to figure out how you're working with people relative to their scale. Because if you don't have the money flowing through like you do in LA, you're not going to be able to do all the creative and innovative things that we're able to do. But that doesn't mean that you have to stop. It just means that you have to figure out where and how you can build up those pieces. The third thing I would say is really identifying what the greatest need is for the community. So most recently I was in Seattle, and one of the things that they had is just this encampment that was really starting to fester. And right, instead of looking at some of the traditional methods of like, we're just going to work at getting these folks into shelter as quickly as we can. No, how do we do things like encampment to home, and really creating that buy-in around encampment to home, and then finding the homes and then moving the people directly into homes is a really effective way to solve the problem, and not as a temporary solution, but as a permanent solution. But you got to invest in the back end too, right? And I know we're going to talk about some of the core components later. So that's really important, is identifying what those greatest needs are, and then helping the communities identify and figure out the ways that they can solve those needs. And it's not just, the other thing I wouldn't say is it's just not about writing different ideas or putting things on paper for communities. I think Kiana talked about this, and Mike maybe a little bit as well, of like, you got to help communities actually implement. People understand the things that they want to get done. It is really hard to get it done. You need support in that. And so one of the things I've learned in my time of being a consultant, a full-time consultant, is I just don't want to go in and just tell people, I can write your plan or I can tell you how to do this, but I actually want to walk alongside of you and help you do those things. So it's really about the implementation pieces, because that's really hard. How do you undo and unpack all the culture, all the establishment, if you will, of the way that we've done things, and figure out how to do things a little bit differently? The next thing I would say is really identify your leaders within the community and uplift those leaders, and make sure that those leaders are representative of the communities that you're serving. Spend time coaching and building up. Some of them don't even need to be coached. They say things, they know things, but for some reason they've been buried in communities. How do you uplift those people, and how do you let them take charge? How do you let them take the lead? Because they have such a deep understanding of their community, and oftentimes they just get buried within the establishment that already exists. So really identifying who those leaders are and figuring out ways to empower them. And then always talking and pointing to the national best practices, I think, is so important. And then figuring out ways that you do that, right? So things like, if we keep looking at our system as this very linear approach of you go from outreach, and then from outreach you go into a shelter bed, and even if we're just talking about shelter beds that are non-congregate over congregate, I know that we've gotten things a little bit better, but if we keep talking about, you have to follow this linear process, like the amount of money that we often waste or spend on certain things, that's not to say that we don't need shelter. We absolutely need shelter. LA is a perfect example of where we have 70,000 people outside. For the love of God, we need to do something more immediate, but not in lieu of. It's both and. And so really helping to identify the national best practices and how you uplift those within communities that are struggling to see them or that are frustrated by how slow they're working or how slow they're moving, and to really level set around how those work. And then really making sure, and this is always of great importance to me, of leading with equity, and not just talking about leading with equity, because a lot we've done, right? We hear this all the time, equity, 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 equity. And then you look in the community and they've done nothing around equity at all. As a matter of fact, it's completely the opposite. They've just kept operating programs of whoever was first in line and those types of things. We have to stop talking about equity and implement equity at every level of our system if we want to do change. So I don't know if that exactly answered the question, Mary Frances, in terms of the way you wanted it, because I can go on a showboat for the next hour, 2 hours, 6 years about master lease.
Me, this is a candid conversation, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And I want to pull on that thread a little bit. We have a question that I'd love for you all to answer live. There's a question from Lenore Kaiser saying, how are communities working to bring in and create space in homeless response systems for those with lived experience? What does that look like from each of your lenses?
Y'all want me to get us started?
Get us started.
Okay, so I got 2 points I want to kind of talk about. I think it is so important that our systems own the fact that we have excluded those smaller Black-led service providers that are doing, and they may or may not call themselves homeless services. They might call themselves prison ministries or community center. We have done our systems a disservice by excluding the, not only for representation, but the brilliance and the relationships. So I say that to say, and the community piece of it. It's so important that we as a system recognize that we are not the experts. The experts are community, and those that are bred in community. Okay, so I said that. But I think it's really important that we yield power, we yield expertise, we yield time, funding, whatever, to folks that know their community best. And in some communities that lives within their COC. And in most communities, that is not the case. So we have to own that, and we have to actively engage with service providers and community leaders that have that expertise, and beg them and encourage them and ask for their support, because that's how we get to that next level. The other thing about making sure that we're engaging people with lived experience. So let me say that the best way to do that is by hiring them at all levels of your organization, of your COC, and paying them for the expertise that they bring in, for the lens that consistently missing, in which we are allowing our exacerbating the business as usual. Like, let's just hire folks because they just know. And I also think it's really important that when there's a thin line between authentic engagement and like really seeking input and partnership in a meaningful way, and tokenism and exploitation. And so the onus on that is on the system. And so we have to make sure that when we are starting initiatives where we are purposefully and intentionally trying to engage people with lived experience, whether it's a focus group of system utilizers, whether they've gone through PSH programming, however we're doing that we're doing that in a meaningful way, not because it's a no-fo question or not because we're looking for just to get a snapshot in time. It's really important that we kind of foster relationships where people can tell us what's not working. And so we, as those that are in positional power, can receive that and can course correct. And then now I'm accountable to the people that that gave me that feedback so that I can course correct, so that it's not a one-time thing. They can hold me accountable to what's not working and what continues not to work year after year. And that's authentic engagement.
And then I just have to jump in with my 2 cents. As someone who's been in a lot of positions of power, as leaders, if you're a system leader and you've been in that role forever, you need to think about your succession plan, and you need to think about setting up the next person, specifically a person with lived experience of homelessness, for success and succession in that role. There's no reason why, in my opinion is not a fact, but there's no reason why I'm going to use an I statement here, should remain in positional power for 5-10 years. You know why? Because I lose touch as a leader with what is most important. I lose perspective, and moving on creates opportunity for someone else to put their fingerprint on a system. It's so important. But I'm not saying just like wake up one day and be like, you know what, I think I'm gonna be done. I'm gonna go do something else. You have to move with intentionality. When I say set people up for success and succession planning, that means mapping out, making sure that you have the historical and institutional knowledge down on paper so that someone has access to it. Making sure that they have the supports in place and the people in place so that they can be successful as they put their fingerprint on a system. Making sure that you're really clear about roles and responsibilities. People with lived experience, I might get slack for this, can't be everything. They can't be storytellers, advisors, policymakers, CEO. Like, it's okay to have a wide variety of roles for people with lived experience in your system that meets their needs, helps them thrive, fulfills the role that they want to play, and runs across the spectrum. Some people are storytellers, and that's beautiful. Some people want to get in on policy making. Some people are like, not for me. So making sure that you create enough right-sized opportunities for folks that will fall on a spectrum in terms of how they want to use their lived experience to help solve homelessness.
Can I jump in and say something really quick? Is someone with lived experience too, and again, I think I stated that it is probably one of the most important components to me in terms of bringing people in the system. Someone in chat had said, you know, if we hire people, we can end homelessness, and I believe that we can end homelessness for a lot of people, like permanent homelessness, by giving them an opportunity. But it has to be intentional, and I think both Kiana and Mary Frances talked about this in terms of, you can't just bring people in and set them in positions and expect them to thrive. You cannot do that. It's setting people up. It's tokenism at its best. It's creating a lane by which you're expecting people to fail so that you can almost point back and say, see, we tried this and it didn't work, and all the reasons why. You have to be intentional about how you bring people in. You have to be willing to coach people. When I first started in this space, going back so many years, I think I come from the substance use, right? My first job was within substance use, but I was placed as a subcontractor within an organization. And I didn't know the difference. I didn't have any boundaries. When we started 27 years, we smoked with clients, we hung out with clients, they washed cars, like we did all that crazy stuff. We didn't know. And nobody told us we were doing anything wrong, right? But there are boundaries, and you got to coach people through those boundaries. You got to talk about people. If you want them to be on the policy table, you have to help them understand the system as to how we got here, how messed up it is, or all the different pieces of it, so that they feel included at the table. They feel empowered to talk at the table. The worst thing to do is say, look, we've created our COC board. We have a bunch of people with lived experience. You sit them at the table and they don't know what to say. They're not sure if they could say anything. They're not comfortable in that situation. You got to set people up right. I was lucky enough. First of all, I recognize I'm a white person, and I want to be very clear about that. My ability to climb out is not going to be the same as everyone else's ability. I recognize that. The places that I come from were some pretty terrible places. And I showed up a certain kind of way. Now, I'm not saying we have to conform people to show up in the white dominant culture. I'm not stating that at all. But I had someone who spent time with me to say, this is the importance of a budget. This is how budgeting works. These are the components of where budget goes. This is why you can't just throw money. This is the importance around accountability. You can't just give people money and then not have an accountability factor on the back end, right? You can't show up at a meeting with your arms crossed and call people idiots. You might think that, but you don't know who you're actually calling an idiot, for lack of a better term. And there's ways, right, that you can convey that message that you want to be able to convey that will work in your benefit. I think we can't just expect people to show up and then expect them to thrive if we don't give them all the tools that they need to thrive. And I think that is so important. The coaching, the mentoring, the making people feel welcomed, creating space. One final thing, and I'll kick it over to you, Mike. I apologize. Kind of passionate about this space. And I just heard this in a meeting. It's almost like when you hire somebody, you have a small team and you hire the new person and you've hired now 3 new people for the same role within this small team. And you wonder why people keep leaving. And it's like, why we hired people that we expected were going to fit within our existing team. You got to blow up that team. That team is now changed. When you're one person left and you're hiring for a new person, the dynamic is going to be different. And that dynamic needs to shift to be inclusive of the new people. The same is true when you're bringing in people with lived experience. The dynamic is changing. And it's not that the person with lived experience needs to fit into your dynamic. You have to help recreate what that new environment is. And I think that that's just really important, to be inclusive, to make people feel welcome, and to help educate them along this process, because there is such value in what they have to say. There is such value in what they have to bring. And we really, truly can end homelessness for a lot of people that are teetering by giving them really great opportunity. So I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, please don't apologize about that, Chris. That's super, super amazing. I don't have a ton to add to what y'all just said. I think the only thing I'll add is, this is like my bureaucrat hat. I'm just gonna like name that. Inside government, there are a lot of people that think this is a total waste of time, right? They think that having people lived experience in positions of power, driving policy, driving this, makes no added value. And so we create reasons for why not to do that. So I'll just like name one of them is like, when it comes to engaging people with lived experience, maybe in a focus group or in some type of in some type of advisory role, you have to be able to pay people for the time and expertise they're bringing. We hire contractors all the time and pay them a lot of money, like a lot of money, and their expertise is so valuable and warranted. It should be no different. We should think no differently about people with lived experience. You know, I come from behavioral health, and I think that field has its own challenges, but the peer movement within substance use and mental health treatment is a couple years ahead of, I would say, where the homeless services system has been. There's licenses, credentialing that has risks, but brings some value in some ways. So I think there's some real conversation that we have to have about why it's so valuable to have people with experience in all parts of our system. And we just have to stop this notion that, like, I mean, I've literally had conversations with folks that will say, well, we can't pay people with lived experience because what if they use the money for X? That is literally some of the conversations we have at a policy level, at a state agency, trying to decide if we should invest in this or not, and if we can invest in it or not. I mean, it needs to be, I also think from the federal government side, it needs to be even more explicit as an allowable cost, a must, a thing that you must have in place to be able to drive policy change. So I think there's systemic things here, not to mention things like, why are we requiring certain degrees or certain educational backgrounds for positions that do not need those types of things? When lived experience brings so much wealth of knowledge and experience. So there's real systemic challenges that we just like gloss over, I think, sometimes when we're designing these things, that we don't have to. We could actually like stop and ask ourselves, like, is a college degree needed for this, or can someone have years of experience in other forms that can bring a ton of value here, and we could work with someone in that way too. So couple different thoughts, but really appreciate the panel and Mary Francis's input on this.
Thanks so much, you all. I'm actually going to take a question. We've got a question here from Eric Gibson. And the nature of the question is how, from a political will, just saying like in order to prevent homelessness, it's got to be political will to maintain basically forever. How can we get leadership to bring the problems to the forefront of the issue and like have public will that is maintained? What does that look like? I know it's hard. I can say that. It's very hard.
Mike, you want to get us started?
Yeah. I love this whole conversation. I think is so important. I mean, so I think one of the tools that we tried to think about for the executive order was, I think the public is very tired of the homeless services system failing to meet objectives that we set for ourselves. And I think there is value in challenging ourselves to reach lofty goals, even when it's hard and even if we can't reach that goal, because the feeling of our system is so often that it's ineffective, it's not working, it's not delivering results. Even when we know, we talk with people whose lives are absolutely changed every single day, but the public doesn't see that. They see what's out their windshield. They see what is in their neighborhood. They see what's on the news. And so I think we need to start to think about how we actively fight the narratives that are out there about who's experiencing homelessness, about why homelessness happens. I think a couple ways that I think are really important for this is we really invested a lot of our time in just having dashboards that show the progress we were making towards our goals. So like every month, it was painful, but every month we would collect the data statewide and produce a dashboard that showed the measurable progress we were having. And it was hard at times because sometimes it didn't show a ton of progress. It was hard to release that dashboard showing we didn't make a lot of progress that month. I think there's some value in having visual ways of showing that we're making an impact with the resources we have. And then I think the other one is like we have to be able to think about how we tell stories, because human beings are storytellers, and we respond to story, not just numbers. We respond so much to story and can connect with people whose lives maybe we can see ourselves in. So I think another thing we've really tried to invest in is like, just videos of people who lived through the thing and got the help and were able to move through that in a way that doesn't toe that line. I think that we're really trying to be cognizant of like using people's stories in an inappropriate way. And so that's some of the things that I think we need to get better at in this industry is like measurable data, committing to a goal and trying to achieve that goal, and then being able to tell the real stories behind those numbers to the extent we can.
So I wanted to add that we have to pay what it costs. We have to pay what it costs. And this is something that I talk about quite often. If it costs $7 million and we give it 2.5, we then need to change the expectations. We need to pay and if we can't pay what it costs, then we need to own as decision makers that the budget is going to be less effective than if we had funded it appropriately. And I think that is retraining service providers that is retraining policymakers. If we continue to underfund programming, we will continue to get outcomes. It is mind-numbing to me that we think we can pay 2.5 for something that costs 7. And we do it every year. And then as systems, we say, okay, at least we got our 2.5. And I just think that and funding is a whole nother thing. I won't, sometimes we don't need funding. Sometimes we need coordination and hard conversations. And if it costs 7, we need to pay 7 because that's what it costs. So I just think it's really important that we own both systems, policymakers, service providers, stakeholders, that we have chronically underfunded this work, which is one of the reasons that we've seen the turnover that we've seen in our systems. Because if we're not paying people to do the work, we're not paying them. It's not their fault. Everybody needs to be able to live and pay rent. And so I think that we have to shift that this is not charity work. This is systems work in the same way healthcare and it's the same kind of work. It's not charity work. So let's stop chronically underfunding things that we know save lives.
I'm going to just say, I say this a lot, I'll say it again here. Our system somehow became expected to solve poverty. And we are not resourced to solve poverty. We didn't create poverty. We didn't create the systemic injustices and the failures. And yet, with the little bit of money that we do get, we're expected to solve everything. We don't control the housing market. We don't own all the property. We can't make landlords rent to our people. We can't tell them to not evict our people. So we're expected to solve, right? And it amazes me, to your point, Kiana, Mike, Mary Frances, I hear this a lot from elected leaders where they're saying, we don't understand. We've given, name the dollar amount, let's use 2.5 million. And the problem is still here. What are you doing with the money? And we're saying we're housing the heck out of people, but we can't control the number of people that fall in. And also, you've still seen Bob out there because no landlord will take Bob, and I can't make them take Bob. And so, right, it stuns me that the lack of just understanding from that perspective, that we have to repeat ourselves so often relative to this. So I appreciate what you both said, because we are the homeless response system, and we can only control what we can control within our realm. And we're not funded to solve everything else. We're not funded to solve for the kids that are coming, right? We have a responsibility to do our best to try to catch these kids as they're coming out of foster care system. But we also need to have a greater expectation. So this comes back to the system of holding other systems accountable to step up and do their work so that these kids don't fall into homelessness. As people are coming out of prison, by the way, as someone who's come out of prison with $200 and no ID, and the expectation that I went to get a job and that could pull myself up by my bootstraps or receive general relief at $200, and right, and a lot of states don't even have general relief, but $227 a month, and I was expected to figure out how to sustain and take care of myself, was not a solution when I was released. There needed to be a better system in place. So we're expected to solve all of these things with such a limited amount of resource and no control over the other things that feed into this. And I think we have to level set. I think we continue to, right? It doesn't do us any favor or any goodwill going out there and pointing the finger at other systems. But I do think that we need to figure out a way that we are messaging the level of control and the level of responsibility that we do have, and what we're doing with the things that we can, with the money that we do have, and the good work that we are doing on the back end of that. And then really working with those other systems. And I think we've done this. The VA, I think we've shown that when the VA invests, look what happens, right? When the managed care plans start investing in things, right? The healthcare system starts investing in things, they'll start to see a decrease in the number of people that are using emergency rooms. So investment from other systems are what's going to, right, and combined with the work that we're doing is what's going to lead to people not falling into homelessness at the rate. When we invest in building housing, when we invest in those things, when we invest in permanent supportive housing, when we invest in those things, that's when we'll start seeing a real difference, I think. Yeah.
So of course, this time has flown by and we're approaching our last 9 minutes. So I want to ask each of you to spend like 2 minutes and 30 seconds on this final question that I have for you. And I want to bring it back to, some of the struggles that you all just talked about from a funding perspective. When there's not adequate funding to maintain fidelity to housing first approaches, it might appear as if housing first doesn't work, right? Kiana, you talked a lot about like meaningful, intentional training of direct service providers. Well, if we've had all of this turnover in our field, that historical knowledge, that institutional knowledge is gone. And so are the best practices with it. So I want to know, what do each of you say to someone that's perhaps new to this field, or maybe they just lost their belief in the evidence-based strategies and approaches that we know work. So what do you say to them if they're struggling with housing first right now?
I'll get us started. I think that I really appreciate the question, because I think that if we're honest with ourselves, there are a lot of folks that are in our work that are struggling with this question. Not, and I really want to go back to the fact that, do we believe that folks have the capacity to change? And if we believe that, we cannot blame individuals for systemic problems. If we believe that, then it behooves us to do the thing, and not do the thing the way we wrote the program guide in 1998. Do the thing that honors the person that's sitting across that desk from us. On that, I see a lot of street outreach providers really like sitting in the grass, really just trying to understand, what does this person on the other end of this conversation, what do they need? And how do we maneuver what the resources, the information, the coalition that we have to get the person what they need. And so I would say to that person that's feeling that friction, to sit in the presence, pause, sit in the presence of the person that's on the other side of you, and trust that they know what they need. And then leverage what you have. We're not going to be able to buy, I don't know, big screens. I don't know, but we can. We do know a thrift store and a free store. And so, how do we leverage what we have, what we know, who we know, to make sure that we're just focusing on the person that's right in front of us. And we have to also find our power as service providers to say to our leadership, to say to our COC, to say to our electeds, this isn't working, and it's not because of the person on the other side. We have built in, I'm going over my 2.5. We have built in things that prevent me as a service provider in being the most effective.
Mike?
Yeah, I'm super glad you went over a little bit. That was brilliant. I think about there is such a move right now. I think in so many cities across the country to blame people experiencing homelessness for the situation they're in. And I think that move is, you know, this reaction of fear and anger and wanting to solve the thing. I just think people need to be able to have a real conversation with people that have lived through homelessness to help reshape some of the notions that folks I think are bringing into this. Like our country is so divided in so many ways, and so I think being able to have that conversation with folks that have lived through it, I think can really change minds in so many ways that can be really powerful. I think where that doesn't work, I do think there is a strong argument to be made just around if you want to solve this problem, if you want homelessness to be reduced, we have to look for ways that actually reduces homelessness. And so there's this part of me that wants to say, you know, it's relationship, it's connection, it's people that will understand. But I also know that realistically, what a lot of folks potentially across the country want to see is they just want the problem to go away. And the only way to make homelessness go away is to house people. So I think that's like a reality that I would love to make sure we're emphasizing. I think there's also this element of like, if this is such an expensive system and we are so underfunded, we have to make do with the little amount of resource we have, and paying for high barrier shelters that sit empty so often, and there's just no people in them because nobody met the bar, the criteria to actually get in them, is the most wasteful thing we could possibly do. And so being able to invest in real solutions that actually ends homelessness, that builds the opportunity for people to get in there. I also think, just as an addictions counselor really quick, I think there's this notion that like harm reduction things are somehow in contradiction to recovery. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. It really sits within an ecosystem of like engaging people. So I just think there's a lot there. I know we're over time.
No, I see some people asking for contact information. So I wanted Chris to close us out with your final thoughts. Contact information is up on the slide so that the many folks that are asking for it can access the information. As a reminder, before I hand it off to Chris to close us out with some final thoughts, this webinar was recorded and it will be posted to our website. Chris, you want to close this out?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to have anything to add, because I think what Mike and what Kiana said, like, sum it up. I'm just going to say two things. Ask a lot of questions, right, to new people that are in before you make a lot of judgment. There's a lot of people that could probably offer a lot of insight as to why some of the things we do. And then on the other end of that is that we need to do a better job of listening. Because the things that we keep doing over and over and over and over again, if they're not working, we need to look at that and make some adjustments to that and be willing to tweak. I always offer up, like, do research, like do as much research as you possibly can. And then never stop yourself from being creative and innovative. I live in the space of creativity and innovation. I believe in calculated risk, but I believe in risk. If we keep doing all the same things over and over and over again, we're never going to learn as a system. We're never going to grow. And we all know that in any business environment, there's the need to continuously grow and to change as you grow. That's just part of it. It's part of growth. And so being creative, being innovative, don't be afraid. It doesn't mean that every one of your ideas is going to hit and is going to stick and going to be the thing. But the willingness to bring that up, and we need to make sure that we're creating the space to bring that up, because without the creativity and innovation, we just keep doing the same old dang thing. So I'll leave it there. I think that's great. And thank you for the invitation today.
Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. We're 1 minute over, but thank you to each of our panelists for a really rich conversation. It's always good to be in company with each of you. Information is on the screen, and thank you to all of our attendees that were either able to join today or folks that are watching this webinar recording.